Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, creating a kinetic force that drives the story forward into the unknown. Experience the thrill of the chase and the heat of the moment with us. Hit subscribe now and feel the incredible energy of a story in motion.
The morning my brother stood up in that courtroom and told the judge I had been stealing from our dying father, I was already looking at the exit sign above the back door. Not because I wanted to run, I just needed something steady to look at. My brother's name is Warren. He is 4 years older than me, and for most of my life I thought that made him wiser. It took me until I was 31 years old, sitting in a hard wooden chair in Pinecrest County Civil Court, to understand that it had only ever made him more practiced at lying. Let me go back. Our father was a difficult man in the way that certain men of his generation are difficult, not cruel exactly, but sealed. He grew up in rural Ohio, worked his whole life in logistics management, and believed that love was something you demonstrated through showing up, not through saying anything out loud. He showed up. I'll give him that. Every school play, every graduation, every Sunday dinner, he showed up. He just never said much once he got there. My mother left when I was 9. Warren was 13. Dad didn't talk about that either. What he did instead was work and save. By the time I was in my 20s, my father had built something quiet and modest and real, a paid-off house in Clover Falls, Indiana, a small investment portfolio, and a savings account that had grown over 40 years of careful, methodical discipline. Nothing flashy, just the product of a man who never trusted anything he couldn't hold on to himself. When he was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's at 63, he called Warren first. I found out 3 days later when my brother texted me. I want to be fair about Warren. He had always been closer to Dad in the geographic sense. He lived 40 minutes away in the same county, ran a landscaping business, went to the same church. I had moved to Washington, D.C. At 24 for a job I couldn't talk about in detail, and that distance had calcified into something between us over the years. Warren thought I was chasing status. Dad thought I was restless. I thought they both just couldn't imagine a life bigger than the one they built in a town of 11,000 people. We were all a little right. We were all a little right. We were all mostly wrong. After the diagnosis, I started coming home more. I took long weekends when I could get them. I helped Dad set up the medical alert system, drove him to his first 2 neurologist appointments, researched the medication adjustments. Warren was there too in the beginning, but Warren had 3 kids and a business that needed him 6 days a week, and gradually his presence at Dad's house became less frequent. I didn't blame him for it, I just noticed it. What I did not notice, because I was naive, was what Warren was doing with the noticing. He was building a case. It started small. A comment at Christmas dinner about how I was in and out and never really around for the hard parts. A remark to our aunt that I'd missed Dad's last checkup. I had, because I'd been on assignment in a location I couldn't name, but I'd arranged for a home health aide to take him instead. Warren didn't mention the aide. He mentioned the absence. I had set up automatic transfers from my personal account to help cover Dad's medical costs. Not because Dad asked, he didn't, he was too proud, but because I had looked at his fixed income against the projected cost of Parkinson's care and done the math. I set it up quietly. I told Dad it was a loan if that made him feel better. He waved his hand and said he'd pay me back someday. We both knew he wouldn't. That was fine. What I didn't know was that Warren had also set himself up with co-signatory access to Dad's primary checking account. Dad had done it 3 years earlier, right after the diagnosis, thinking it was practical. Warren could pay bills if Dad had a bad week. Normal family stuff. Except Warren had been using it. I didn't find out until the December before the hearing, when Dad's home health aide, a quiet woman named Miss Pratt who had been with him for 8 months, called me on a Tuesday evening and said she was worried. She said Dad had asked her to pick up a prescription refill and given her his debit card and it had declined. She'd covered it herself. She was calling because she thought I should know. I checked the account online that night. In 14 months, just over $62,000 had moved out of my father's primary savings in transfers Warren had authorized. There was no record of medical payments, no home improvement receipts, nothing traceable to my father's care. I stayed up until 2 in the morning making copies of everything. I called an attorney the next day. Her name was Harriet Bloom, and she had been practicing elder law in Indiana for 22 years. She was small and precise, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she did not waste a single word. When I laid out what I had found, she looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Your brother may have made a significant miscalculation." I didn't say anything. "He may have been counting on the fact that you're rarely in state," she said, "and that your father wouldn't notice." "My father notices everything," I said. "He just doesn't say anything." She almost smiled. "Then we have something to work with." I want to pause here and explain something about my job because it matters to what comes next. I work for a federal agency. I have worked for the same agency for 7 years. The nature of my work means that my employment records are not publicly searchable. My tax documents are filed through a separate federal process, and the documentation of my salary and title exists in systems that require specific security clearance to access. I cannot walk into a bank and hand them a pay stub. I cannot produce a W-2 that looks normal. My employment, to anyone who doesn't have the right access, is functionally invisible. Warren knew this. He had always found it convenient. What he apparently did not account for was that invisible is not the same as non-existent. Harriet filed a motion on my behalf for an accounting of all transactions from my father's accounts in the prior 24 months. Warren's attorney, a man named Douglas Fitch, who I recognized from his billboards on Route 9, immediately countered by filing a petition to have me removed as a party in my father's estate planning documents, on the grounds that I had been contributing financially to my father in ways that constituted undue influence, and that I had, in his phrasing, demonstrated a pattern of financial interference inconsistent with the interests of the estate. It was breathtaking, honestly. The audacity of it. He was accusing me of the thing he had done, louder and first, hoping the noise would drown out the evidence. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in March. I flew in the night before and stayed at my father's house. He was having a reasonable week. His hands were steadier than they'd been at Christmas, and we sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and he poured us both a small glass of whiskey, which he wasn't supposed to have, and we didn't talk about the next day at all. We talked about a book he was reading. We talked about a documentary he'd watched about deep-sea fishing. He asked me if I was eating enough. I told him I was. When I got up to go to bed, he said, without looking up from his glass, "I know what your brother did." I stood in the doorway. "I've known for a while," he said. "I just didn't know what to do about it." "You don't have to do anything," I said. "That's what I'm here for." He nodded once. That was all. The courtroom in Pinecrest County is not large. It has beige walls and fluorescent lighting and a faint smell of industrial cleaner that I associated, from that day forward, with the feeling of controlled dread. I sat at the respondent's table with Harriet. Warren sat across the room with Douglas Fitch. My father was not present. Harriet had advised against it, and he had agreed without argument. Warren looked confident. That was the word for it. He sat with his shoulders back and his hands folded on the table, and he nodded at his attorney with the ease of a man who believed he had already won. He had told our aunt, apparently, that this was just a formality, that I would fold once I realized how it looked. Me, the absent sister, the one who worked in the shadows, the one nobody could verify. Douglas Fitch opened by describing me as an intermittent presence in my father's life, who had used financial contributions as leverage to insert myself into estate decisions that did not reflect my father's actual wishes. He used the word manipulation 3 times in his opening statement. He said I had taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly man's trust. I looked at the exit sign. When it was Harriet's turn, she stood up and said, "Your Honor, we will demonstrate this morning that the financial irregularities in Mr. Traum Alderman's accounts originate entirely with my client's brother, and that my client's own contributions, which are substantial and fully documented, have been made consistently and without expectation of inheritance. We will also be introducing supporting documentation from a federal agency regarding my client's employment status, which will require a brief recess for Your Honor to review privately before we proceed." Douglas Fitch looked up from his notepad. Warren's jaw shifted. Just slightly. The judge, her name was the Honorable Sylvia Crane, and she had been on the bench in Pinecrest County for 16 years, looked at Harriet over her glasses and said, "Noted, Counselor, continue." Harriet walked the court through the bank records first. 14 months, $62,430. She had organized everything chronologically, and she presented it without drama, just numbers and dates, and a quiet, even voice that somehow made each line item land harder than shouting would have. She showed the transfers. She showed what they were not paying for: no medical invoices, no care facility receipts, no home repair records. She showed Miss Pratt's statement about the declined card. Douglas Fitch objected 3 times. Judge Crane overruled him twice and sustained once on a technicality that Harriet immediately corrected. Then Fitch called Warren to speak. Warren talked for about 15 minutes. He talked about how hard it had been to be the one who stayed, how he had managed Dad's day-to-day needs while I was traveling for work. He said it with a particular inflection, like he was doing air quotes he'd decided not to make visible. He said the money he'd moved had gone toward a landscaping project at Dad's property that Dad had verbally requested. He said there were no written records because it was a family arrangement. He said he had been the reliable one, the present one, the one who answered the phone at 2 in the morning when Dad fell in the hallway. That last part was true, actually. Warren had answered that call. He had driven over. I had not been there. It was the most effective thing he said, and I watched 2 of the 3 people in the gallery, our aunt and a neighbor of my father's, shift almost imperceptibly in their seats when he said it. Then Harriet stood up and said, "Your Honor, at this time I'd like to request a brief recess to allow you to review the documentation I referenced in my opening." Judge Crane looked at her for a moment. "How brief? 10 minutes should be sufficient." Judge Crane nodded and called the recess. Harriet handed a sealed envelope to the clerk, who walked it to the bench. I watched the judge take it into her chambers. I watched the door close. Warren leaned over and said something to Douglas Fitch in a low voice. Fitch shook his head once. I looked at my hands. They were steady. I was almost surprised by that. 9 minutes later, Judge Crane returned to the bench. She sat down. She set the envelope flat in front of her. She folded her hands on top of it, and she looked across the room with an expression I could not immediately read. Not warm, not cold, just very still and very certain. "I've reviewed the documentation," she said. "Counselor Bloom, you may proceed." "Thank you, Your Honor," Harriet said. She turned to address the room. "My client, for the past 7 years, has been employed as a senior operations analyst with a federal agency. Her annual compensation during that period has ranged from $94,000 to $112,000. This documentation, reviewed by His Honor, confirms her employment history, her income, and the source of the transfers she made into her father's accounts, totaling just over $48,000 across the period in question." She paused. "My client was not stealing from her father. She was supporting him." Warren's face did something I had not seen it do before. It went blank in a specific way. Not the blankness of calm, but the blankness of a man watching something he built very carefully begin to come apart. Douglas Fitch cleared his throat and said he would need time to verify the documentation. Judge Crane said, "The documentation has been verified to my satisfaction, Mr. Fitch. Please continue, Counselor Bloom." What came next was another 40 minutes of Harriet walking through every dollar I had sent my father against every dollar Warren had moved out of those same accounts. She had a spreadsheet. She had screenshots. She had a statement from the bank flagging 3 of Warren's larger transfers as inconsistent with the account holder's established spending patterns, a flag that had been generated automatically and then quietly buried when Warren had called the branch manager, who happened to go to his church. That last part made the judge write something down. By the time Harriet finished, Douglas Fitch had stopped objecting. Warren was looking at the table. Judge Crane took a recess to deliberate. She came back in 25 minutes. She found in my favor on every point. She ordered a full forensic accounting of my father's accounts for the prior 3 years. She referred the matter of Warren's transfers to the county prosecutor's office for review. She noted in her ruling that the characterization of my employment history as unknown or suspicious had been, in her assessment, a deliberate litigation strategy designed to obscure the actual financial record. And she said that with a precision and a flatness that made Douglas Fitch go slightly pink. She also said one other thing, at the very end, before she closed the session. She said, the person who was present for this man's care was not necessarily the person who was in the same room. Presence takes more than one form. I don't know if she said it for me or for the record, or just because it was true. Maybe all 3. I walked out into the hallway and stood there for a minute. Our aunt came out behind me and touched my arm without saying anything. That was enough. I drove back to my father's house. He was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the radio on low, a talk program he liked about American history. He looked up when I came in. "Well?" he said. "It went fine," I said. He looked at me for a moment. He nodded. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make you a sandwich." So I sat, and he made me a sandwich, turkey mustard. the same as he'd made me since I was 7 years old, and we sat at the kitchen table together and the radio talked quietly about the War of 1812, and neither of us said anything about Warren or the courthouse or the $48,000 or any of it. Some things you don't need to say out loud. On the drive to the airport that Sunday, I stopped at a gas station on Route 9 and filled the tank. Warren's billboard was on the building across the street. Alderman Landscaping and Property Services. A photo of him smiling in front of a riding mower. I looked at it for a minute. Then I got in the car and drove. There's something I've thought about a lot in the months since the hearing. My brother had spent years building a version of me in other people's minds. The one who left, the one who didn't show up, the one whose job was too mysterious to be real. He built it carefully, with small comments over a long time. The way you build anything that's meant to hold weight. And the thing is, some of it was true. I did leave. I was away more than I was home. There were calls I missed and dinners I skipped and moments I wasn't there for. That's real. I've sat with that. But he made a mistake that a lot of people make when they're used to getting away with something. He mistook my absence for inattention. He thought that because I wasn't watching, I didn't know. He thought that because my work was invisible, I was powerless. He forgot that invisible and powerless are not the same thing. My father's forensic accounting came back 6 weeks after the hearing. The county prosecutor's office opened a formal investigation. I don't know exactly where that stands right now, and I'm not going to speculate. What I know is that my father's accounts are frozen pending resolution, that he is being cared for with funds I set up through a separate trust that Warren cannot access, and that Ms. Pratt is still coming every weekday morning at 8. He called me last week, just to talk. We were on the phone for 40 minutes. He told me about a blue heron that had been visiting the pond out back. He told me there'd been a frost that damaged the early tulips. He told me Ms. Pratt had taught him to make a Filipino rice porridge that he'd eaten 3 days in a row because he liked it so much. Before we hung up, he said, "You know I'm proud of you." He'd never said that before. Not in 31 years. I said, "I know, Dad." I meant it. Some balances take a long time to settle, but they do settle eventually. They always do. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that courtroom. Not the legal part, the human part. Warren didn't lose because he was unlucky. He lost because of a series of choices he made over a long time, each one small enough to feel safe, each one building on the last. He moved a little money. Nobody said anything. He moved more. He told a story about me that made the moving easier to justify. He told it so many times he may have started to believe it himself. That's how it usually works. The lie doesn't start big. It starts with a version of events that's just convenient enough to repeat. And I think about my own choices too, because they matter here just as much. I chose for years to let people think what they wanted about my work and my absence. I told myself it was discretion. Some of it was. But some of it was also just easier than explaining, easier than fighting the narrative Warren was quietly building while I was looking the other way. I was not innocent of inattention. I just wasn't guilty of what he accused me of. There's a difference between those two things, and it took me a long time to stop collapsing them together. What I know now is that integrity isn't something you perform when people are watching. It's the thing you do when no one is. The transfers I set up quietly, the appointments I arranged from a different time zone, the phone calls I made from places I couldn't name. Nobody saw that. Warren certainly didn't count on it. But it existed, and when it mattered, it was the only thing that held. My father is not a man who explains himself. He never has been. But he knew. He told me so. That night before the hearing, in the same quiet way he's communicated everything important, his whole life. Not with speeches, but with a glass of whiskey and a single sentence and the willingness to finally say it out loud. He had known for a while. He just hadn't known what to do. I think a lot of people find themselves there, watching something wrong happen and feeling too tired or too outnumbered or too uncertain to act. That's not weakness. That's just being human and overwhelmed. The question is, what you do when someone finally shows up to stand next to you. I showed up late to a lot of things in my father's life. I own that. But I showed up to that one. Warren made the mistake of building his case on the assumption that my silence meant I had nothing, that my invisible work meant I was empty-handed, that the distance between us could be used as evidence against me. He had never understood that the most important work often happens out of sight, that the people who seem to be doing nothing are sometimes the ones carrying the most weight. He confused visibility with value. He always had. That was the real miscalculation. The blue heron my father mentioned on the phone last week. He said it comes every morning now, stands at the edge of the pond for a while, and then leaves. He said he started having his coffee by the window just to watch for it. That's a small thing, but it's the kind of small thing that only happens when someone's life is stable enough to notice it. That stability didn't appear on its own. Some balances are invisible until they're not. That's the part Warren never understood.